She wakes with no memory, no past, no idea why a German shepherd guards her like a soldier on sacred ground. Every step she takes uncovers fragments of a life that feels stolen, familiar and foreign, beautiful and terrifying, all at once. 10 forgotten places begin calling her back, but someone, somewhere, is desperate. She never remembers what really happened in the last one. Then she finds a grave, fresh dug, her name carved deep, the date marked, tomorrow. And the dog won't stop growling at what's buried beneath. County Clerk Harold Jenkins, who notarized Ray's will in silence, couldn't yet know that June would one day question every line he stamped. Lorraine, a respected choir leader and secret mother, had no idea Paul suspected Ray's death wasn't as peaceful as people believed. Ellie, the rightful heir to everything Ray couldn't say aloud, certainly had no idea she was already living in that house, under a different name. It all began with the sound of the wind tapping gently on the kitchen window, like an old friend knocking with soft fingers, hoping not to startle but to be let in just the same. The woman had woken that morning with no memory of where she was or why the light falling through the curtains looked so unfamiliar, even though the room carried the faint smell of oatmeal and mothballs that should have comforted her. She sat up slowly, knees aching in that dull, lifelong way they'd done since '89, when she'd slipped on the back porch ice and never quite walked the same again. The dog, tall, alert, ears like antennae pointed straight at heaven, stood silently in the doorway, watching her the way a lighthouse might keep watch over a sailor who's forgotten which ocean he's drifting in. There were no photos on the walls, only faint outlines where frames once hung, as if someone had stripped the house of its past and left only the shell of what used to be a life. The woman walked barefoot across the linoleum, each step careful, like she was testing the ground for booby traps, her eyes darting from table to chair to window, looking for something, anything, that might whisper who she was. Her hands trembled not from fear, not exactly, but from a gnawing, hollow confusion, the kind that steals into your bones like cold and doesn't let go no matter how many layers you wear. And still, the dog didn't move, just stared with an intensity that felt human, maybe even divine, like it knew her better than she knew herself. On the kitchen counter, she found a crumpled note in someone's neat, looping script that read, "If you forget again, follow her." Below it, a single word was underlined twice, Maggie. The dog tilted its head then, as if hearing her name through time, through fog, through the spaces between broken memories. The woman folded the note into her pocket like a lifeline and, without knowing why, followed the dog out the door. They walked past the garden gate that hadn't latched in decades, down a narrow path overtaken by weeds and silence, until the woman stopped in front of a fence painted long ago in what might have been white. The dog barked once, low, patient, not an alarm but a command, and nudged open the side gate with its snout like it had done this 1,000 times before. She stepped inside, and the air changed, heavier, dustier, but full of something that made her throat catch like a sob half swallowed. An old apple tree stood crooked in the corner of the yard, its limbs still heavy with fruit that looked like it had waited all season just for her. Then she saw the bench beneath the tree, paint peeling, cushion sun faded, and on it, a wooden box sealed tight with a leather strap. Her hands, though slow, moved without hesitation as if memory lived in her fingers even if her mind had gone dry. She undid the strap, lifted the lid, and found inside a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, each envelope stained with age and something softer, maybe perfume, maybe time itself. She pulled the top letter free, unfolded it, and read the first line aloud, her voice shaking like a bridge just before collapse. "To my Ellie, if you're reading this, it means your mind has gone again, and I'm not there to bring you back." Her knees gave way, and she sat on the bench hard, the kind of sit that comes when your body remembers before your brain does, and tears rose without her permission. Maggie lay down at her feet, resting her chin on the woman's shoe like an anchor tying them both to this earth. The woman read the second line of the letter aloud, slower now, like reciting a prayer she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. "So I've left you this trail, one memory at a time, and I've asked her to guide you, because she never forgot you, even when you forgot yourself." And for the first time that day, something broke loose inside her, a small warmth, flickering like a pilot light long gone cold, sparking back to life. She looked at Maggie and whispered, not knowing why the name felt both foreign and familiar on her tongue. "Where are we going next, girl?" The dog stood up slowly, tail twitching once in answer, then padded toward the open gate. And then a voice, quiet, hoarse, uncertain, rose from the woman's throat like the dust from that box. "Do you think they'll remember me?" "You'd be surprised," came a voice, gravelly yet kind, rising from the side of the path like a breeze rustling through tired leaves. The woman turned slowly, unsure if the words had been spoken aloud or just summoned from some stubborn corner of her mind, but there, leaning against the rusted fence with a cane in one hand and a worn cap in the other, stood a man whose eyes held 1,000 September skies. He tipped his head, not in greeting but in recognition, though she couldn't recall ever seeing his face. Something about his posture, the slight tilt of his shoulders, made her stomach stir as though a song had started playing somewhere deep inside her bones. "You think folks forget so easy," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of porch swings, unpaid debts, and Sunday suppers long since cleared, "but some things stick, even when time does its best to scrub the slate clean." Maggie padded forward, slow but sure, and sat beside the man like she knew him. No bark, no warning, just that steady canine trust that only comes from years of silent understanding. The woman opened her mouth to ask his name, but the question vanished before it reached her lips, drowned beneath the sudden flood of memory that surged as she looked past the fence and saw the old white church half hidden by willow trees that hadn't been trimmed in a decade. The bells didn't ring anymore, rusted now, frozen in silence, but her ears filled with the echo of hymns sung through thin cotton masks and whispered prayers over clasped hands. "You used to sit right there," the man said, nodding toward the second pew on the left, where sunlight now pooled like spilled gold through a broken stained glass window. "Right next to your mother, every Sunday at 10, dressed like you were about to meet the president himself." The woman stepped through the open gate, one hand trailing along the fence like a blind woman reading Braille from another lifetime, each rough edge and flaking bit of paint writing stories onto her skin. Inside, the church smelled of cedar, wax, and ghosts, familiar and distant, like an old friend you haven't written to in years but still think about when you can't sleep. A woman stood near the altar, short, round-shouldered, with gray hair pulled into a neat bun and a voice that wrapped around you like a quilt your grandmother made. "Ellie?" she asked, not timidly, but as someone asking a question she already knew the answer to, like a teacher taking attendance for the 1,000th time. Ellie didn't answer, not right away, because her name sounded strange in someone else's mouth, like trying on a dress she used to wear in another body. "You sang here," the woman continued, her eyes growing misty, "every Easter and every Christmas Eve. My Daniel had a crush on you, he practiced his bow tie just to impress you." Ellie blinked, and in that moment something stirred, distant, fluttering, like a curtain caught in a breeze, because she could almost hear the creak of the piano pedals and the sharp smell of lemon oil that Miss Alberta used to polish the pews. "I don't remember singing," Ellie whispered, her voice soft and brittle, like the pages of a forgotten Bible. "Your voice made people cry," the other woman said, stepping forward and placing a calloused hand gently on Ellie's arm. "Not because it was perfect, Lord knows it wasn't, but because you sang like your heart had nowhere else to live but in that song." They stood in silence then, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled, as Maggie lay quietly by the altar, her head resting between her paws, ears twitching at sounds only she could hear. The sun shifted behind the clouds, casting long shadows through the cracked windows, and Ellie felt the weight of something pressing gently against her chest, not painful, not heavy, but undeniable. Then the man outside spoke again, not loud but clear enough to reach her through the open door. "You remember the day the roof leaked and you held the umbrella for Reverend Mills while he preached?" Ellie didn't laugh, not quite, but her lips curled just slightly, like a photograph developing in the darkroom of her mind. She did remember that umbrella, polka-dotted, ridiculous, borrowed from a child in the front row, and she remembered how the Reverend never missed a beat, even as rain slid down his spectacles. As she turned to leave, her hand brushing once more against the pew, she looked at the woman by the altar and said, "I wish I could remember it all." "You will," the woman replied, her voice firm like stone worn smooth by river water. "One piece at a time." Maggie barked once, soft, deliberate, and led her back down the path, through the gate, toward the road where the world waited with its memories tucked in corners Ellie hadn't yet uncovered. At the edge of the property, where the gravel met the long road that disappeared into the trees, the old man asked without looking back. "Do you remember the place where you said goodbye?" "Yes," she finally whispered, not because the memory had returned all at once, like thunder crashing through a quiet sky, but because something inside her had stirred, quiet and cautious, like a turtle lifting its head from the mud after a long winter. It wasn't a place she could name outright, not yet, but the word, goodbye, settled in her chest like a note struck just slightly off-key, haunting in its almost familiarity. Maggie had already started walking, slow and steady, tail low but purposeful, as if the dog knew that the answer Ellie sought wasn't behind her in that church, but further down the road, past the town's edge where the paint peeled faster than the buildings aged and where old neon signs still flickered their last breath after sunset. They walked past the grocery store that had turned into a bait shop, past the post office with the broken flagpole, past the old gas station where a boy once offered to pump gas for her mother just for the chance to see Ellie smile. She didn't stop. She couldn't, not when the feeling inside her was beginning to bloom into something both tender and heavy, like rain clouds swelling with a storm that wasn't ready to break. The gravel turned to dirt, and the dirt turned to grass, and finally the grass gave way to gravel again, but this time, it was different. Ahead stood a building with chipped green paint and a leaning porch that looked like it had seen more summer nights than most marriages. A sign swung lazily from rusted hooks above the door, Pine Grove Cafe. The letters were faded, but the scent that drifted from the doorway, coffee, fried onions, and just a whisper of sweet tobacco, hit her like a song half heard on a jukebox in a time she couldn't quite place. A bell jingled overhead as she stepped inside, the kind of bell that used to announce more than customers, it used to announce moments. First dates. Breakups. War letters. Homecomings. And inside, at the far corner booth near the window, sat a woman with her back to the door, her silver hair pulled into a braid that fell like a river down her back. She turned slowly, not surprised, not startled, just calm, like she'd been waiting a long, long time for this exact moment. "You came back," the woman said, setting her coffee down with both hands, as though it were something sacred. Her eyes were green, sharp, and wet at the edges, not from sadness, but from the kind of joy that's built entirely from relief. "I thought maybe you'd gone for good this time." Ellie didn't speak. Not because she had nothing to say, but because every word that came to mind seemed either too big or too small to fit the ache in her chest. She simply nodded, and slowly sat down across from her, letting Maggie curl up beneath the table like they'd done it 1,000 times before. "You said goodbye right here," the woman continued, voice quiet but sure, like she was laying out a deck of cards that had already been dealt. "That night in '83, after the funeral. You sat right there, ordered sweet tea, and told me you couldn't stay in this town one more second." The word slid into Ellie's ears like a lullaby gone wrong, gentle, but weighted with something unspoken. "Whose funeral?" she asked, though even as she said it, her fingers started trembling as if her body remembered what her mind had lost. "Your brother's," came the answer. "Ray. Car wreck out on Route 5. You were the one who identified the body. You held it together better than anyone thought you could, until the next morning, when you disappeared." Ellie didn't cry, not yet, but her heart recoiled as if the memory had struck it with a closed fist. She saw flashes now, Ray's crooked smile, his arm around her shoulders in a photo by the lake, the locket he gave her when she turned 16 with the words, "Stay Wild, L," engraved in it. She had worn it every day, until the funeral. "I left because I couldn't find him in this place anymore," she said, finally, voice cracking just slightly, like a tree branch under fresh snow. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt right. The woman nodded slowly, reaching across the table to place her hand over Ellie's. Her skin was warm, dry, calloused in that maternal way that comes from hard work and harder years. "Sometimes we say goodbye not because we're ready," she said, "but because we can't bear to stay." They sat there in silence, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant tick of a wall clock stuck at 3:42. Then Maggie stirred, rose to her feet, and nudged Ellie gently beneath the table. The woman across from her smiled faintly and pulled something from her purse, a small box, wrapped in a ribbon so faded it might have once been red. "He left this for you," she said. "Said to give it back if you ever found your way home." Ellie opened it slowly, her fingers stiff but deliberate, and inside she found a photograph, Ray in his army jacket, grinning wide, holding a newborn baby in his arms. The back read, "You held her first. She'll remember you." Ellie looked up, heart pounding, voice trembling, as the question slipped from her lips without warning. "Where is she now?" "She's exactly where you left her," the woman at the cafe said softly, not with judgment or bitterness, but with a quiet resignation that wrapped around the booth like a wool blanket on a cold afternoon. "You just don't remember leaving." Ellie stared at the photo again, her brother's arms cradling the baby as if she were made of porcelain and prayers, her own face faintly visible in the edge of the frame, eyes swollen, smile forced, something about her expression torn between joy and a grief so deep it left no fingerprints. "She was a baby," Ellie murmured, mostly to herself, though the other woman nodded anyway, as if answering a question she'd been waiting decades to hear again. "A baby born into a family already splitting apart at the seams," the woman replied. "Her mama gone not long after, and Ray, well, you know how that ended. So she was passed along, like so many children are, between cousins, neighbors, folks who meant well but didn't always know what to do with a child that reminded them too much of what they'd lost." Ellie closed the box slowly, carefully, as if it might shatter in her hands if she moved too quickly, and Maggie let out a low sound, half sigh, half growl, restless in the way dogs get when the world shifts and their people don't yet understand why. "She's not a baby anymore," the woman added gently, eyes searching Ellie's face for signs of something she couldn't name. "She's grown now. Teaches art at the elementary school out by the water tower. Lives in a cottage house just off Oak Hollow Road." The words landed heavy, not like news, but like truth that had been waiting patiently just behind the curtains, waiting for Ellie to pull the cord and let it in. She stood, steadied herself against the table, and Maggie rose with her, alert, ready, as if the dog had known all along this was the next stop on a journey that was never really about where, but who. The road to Oak Hollow was lined with trees that bowed low from years of weather and time, their branches forming a canopy of green so thick it almost blocked out the sun. The shadows played tricks with her mind, painting memories that came in fragments, a child's laughter, a porch swing creaking in rhythm with the wind, a smell like baby powder and cinnamon that made her heart ache with longing. When they reached the house, small, tidy, blue with white shutters and a mailbox shaped like a birdhouse, Maggie paused at the edge of the walkway and looked back, as if asking if Ellie was ready to knock on the door of the past. She wasn't. But she stepped forward anyway. The porch groaned beneath her weight, familiar in a way that made her knees weak, and she raised her hand to knock but didn't need to. The door opened before she could touch it. A young woman stood there, 30s, maybe, with dark curly hair and eyes that shimmered in the sunlight like wet leaves. She didn't look surprised. She didn't even speak. She just looked at Ellie for a long, long time, until finally she smiled the kind of smile that comes from old pain making room for new peace. "I thought you might come," the woman said. "Eventually." Ellie tried to respond, but her throat caught, dry and tight, as if her body had forgotten how to form words for this kind of moment. The woman stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. The inside smelled like paint and fresh bread, and the walls were covered in canvases, some abstract, some portraits, one unmistakably of Ray, eyes soft and sad, the curve of his jaw exactly as Ellie remembered. "I never knew where to send this," the woman said, handing Ellie a bundle wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "But I saved it, in case you ever came back." Ellie untied the string with shaking fingers and peeled back the paper to find a child's drawing, stick figures, a house, a sun with too many rays, and the words, "Me and Auntie Ellie at the lake." Her knees gave way, but she didn't fall, not with Maggie leaning against her leg and the young woman kneeling beside her, holding her steady. "I drew it after the last time I saw you," the woman whispered. "I always wondered why you didn't come back. Ellie swallowed hard, closed her eyes, and said, "Because I thought I didn't matter anymore." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of years, of questions unasked and answers never mailed, of hugs that never happened and birthdays missed. But in that silence, something shifted, small, but real. "I'm still here," the woman said. "You mattered then. You matter now." Ellie opened her eyes and saw her own reflection in the younger woman's gaze, not as she was, but as she had been and might yet become. She reached out slowly, touched the woman's hand, and asked, with a voice so fragile it barely crossed the space between them. "Will you walk with me?" "Yes," the woman said without hesitation, her voice gentle but sure, like a lighthouse keeping watch through fog thick with forgotten years and buried longing. "But if we go there, you have to promise me something, not to run when it gets hard, and not to lie when the memories come knocking." Ellie nodded slowly, not because she was certain she was ready, but because something inside her had begun to shift, quietly, steadily, like ice melting beneath the surface of a frozen lake. They walked in silence at first, the gravel crunching beneath their feet in soft rhythm with Maggie's steady gait, the road unfolding ahead like an old letter finally reopened after years of pretending it no longer mattered. The air was heavier out there, thicker with history, denser with echoes, because they were walking toward a place that once held everything and now held almost nothing. The house appeared like a ghost does, not all at once, but in slow pieces that materialized from the edges of memory, first the chimney leaning slightly east, then the outline of a broken swing, and finally the porch steps with that familiar crack in the third board from the bottom. It hadn't been painted in decades, and vines had crept up one side like time itself trying to pull the place back into the ground. "You lived here," the woman said, motioning toward the screen door that hung open like a crooked smile, as if daring them to step inside and disturb the dust that had long since settled into stillness. Ellie didn't respond, but her feet moved forward, as though the floorboards themselves had remembered her weight and were calling her back one step at a time. The smell hit her first, not rot, not mildew, but something deeper, like old furniture and the last page of a favorite book, folded and forgotten. Inside, the rooms were smaller than she remembered, though that's how it always is when you return to places you once filled with childhood laughter and adult heartache. The kitchen still had the old clock above the stove, hands frozen at 9:14, and the wallpaper, yellowed now, still bore faint outlines where family photos had once hung like badges of a life being lived out loud. "I used to sit right there," Ellie said, pointing to a worn spot at the head of the table, her voice more breath than sound. "Every morning with my coffee and the comics. Ray would read the headlines and try to explain the world to me like I was new to it every day." The woman smiled faintly, brushing her fingers along the windowsill where someone, once long ago, had carved a name, Ellie, followed by a small, uneven heart. They moved through the house like archaeologists of their own past, each room offering fragments, a coat still hanging on a hook by the door, a cracked mirror in the hallway reflecting not their faces, but every version of themselves that had ever passed before it. Then, in the back room, the one Ray had used as a study, Ellie paused. The desk was still there, though warped from age and weather, and beside it, on the floor beneath a dusty blanket, sat a record player she hadn't seen since the winter they lost their father. "Ray used to play this old jazz record," she murmured, crouching slowly and brushing the dust from the top with trembling fingers. "He said it helped him think," said the trumpet was the sound of someone trying to outrun regret. She opened the lid, half expecting it to fall apart in her hands, but it didn't, it held. And inside, sitting just where he'd left it, was the record, Miles Davis, Kind of Blue. The label was faded, the sleeve torn, but it was there. She placed it on the turntable, lowered the needle, and after a few crackles, there it was. That sound. Soft, searching, sad in the way a man sounds when he's finally told the truth too late. The two women stood there as the music filled the room like a forgotten prayer, and Maggie lay down quietly, as if even she knew this moment was meant to be still. When the last note faded, Ellie turned to the woman beside her and asked, with a voice thick with all the years she'd lost. "Why did he keep everything the same?" "Because he couldn't bring himself to change what he was still waiting for," the woman answered, her voice low and steady, as though she were reciting a truth that had been tucked inside her for so long it had lost all sharpness, softened by time and sorrow alike. Ellie didn't speak right away, because somewhere between the record's final note and the quiet weight of those words, she'd felt something shift deep within her, something old and tender, like a bruise finally touched after years of pretending it had healed. She looked around the room slowly, her gaze lingering on small things she hadn't noticed before, the dust-lined outline of a lamp that used to sit on the shelf, a worn corner of the rug where her brother used to pace when he couldn't sleep, and the unmistakable scent of cedar and pipe tobacco that still clung to the corners like a stubborn ghost. She crossed the room in careful steps, each one slow and deliberate, and lowered herself into the armchair beside the desk, the same chair Ray had spent countless hours in, scribbling notes, paying bills, or simply staring out the window at nothing in particular. Maggie followed, resting her chin on Ellie's foot, eyes half closed but alert in that way only dogs are, knowing something important was near without understanding what it might be. The drawer of the desk creaked when she opened it, just slightly, as if unsure it still remembered how to move, and inside she found the usual things, yellowed receipts, old pens, a pair of reading glasses with one arm taped together with electrical tape, and a small envelope resting atop a dog-eared Bible. The envelope had no address, no stamp, just her name, written in her brother's familiar, slanted handwriting, Ellie. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it, and for a moment she just held it there, unable to open it, afraid that whatever was inside would change something she wasn't ready to lose again. But the woman, her niece, knelt beside her, placed a steadying hand on Ellie's knee, and nodded once, the kind of nod that says it's time. She opened it slowly, carefully, like a relic being revealed, and unfolded the single page inside. The paper was thick, slightly yellowed, the edges curled as though someone had held it too many times without ever having the courage to send it. Ellie. If you're reading this, then I suppose I never got the chance to say what I meant to that night, after the service, before you walked out the door and didn't come back. I don't blame you for leaving. I understood, even then, that some losses cut so deep they take more than time to heal, they take parts of us we don't always have to give again. But I kept everything the same, not because I was stuck, but because I wanted you to have something to come home to if you ever needed it. I knew you might forget, Ellie. I saw it starting in your eyes years before you did. You always laughed it off, but I knew. I read books. I talked to the doctor. I saw it coming. So I left things where you last saw them, hoping one day you might find your way back, and remember, not just the place, but the parts of yourself you didn't know were still waiting. And if you don't remember, that's okay. Maggie will know. I made sure of that. You were never alone, sis. Not for one day. Ray. Ellie didn't cry, not the way people cry in movies, with sobs and shaking shoulders, but her eyes filled slowly, the tears rising like warm water in a bathtub, soft and relentless, until they finally slipped down her cheeks in silence. She pressed the letter to her heart and breathed in deep, as though his words had traveled across years and sorrow to land squarely in the center of her chest. Her niece stood, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled down a photo album Ellie hadn't seen in decades, the leather cracked, the pages stiff. He added to it every year, she said, placing it in Ellie's lap. Even after you left. He said it wasn't complete without you in it. Ellie opened it, saw herself laughing beside Ray in a boat on Lake Martin, saw a Christmas photo with him in a ridiculous sweater, saw a final picture, one she didn't remember posing for, where she stood beside Maggie in front of the very gate they'd passed that morning. As she closed the album and looked out the dusty window toward the road that led them there, she whispered more to herself than anyone else. What else did he leave behind? He left something with me, came a voice from behind the porch screen, soft as dusk but carrying just enough weight to still the air like a held breath before a storm. Ellie turned slowly, eyes adjusting to the light that filtered through the warped wood and torn mesh, and saw a tall man standing there, broad-shouldered, sunburnt, with a face that looked like it had spent too many years outdoors and not enough years smiling. Maggie rose first, tail wagging low and deliberate, as though she recognized the man not by scent but by something deeper, something remembered across shared silence and unspoken grief. You don't know me, the man said, stepping forward with the quiet certainty of someone who didn't need introductions to speak the truth. But I knew your brother. Worked with him out at the factory in town, back before everything changed and the place shut its doors for good. Ellie didn't respond right away, didn't have to, really, because her silence had always been a kind of invitation, and this man looked like someone who'd been waiting a long time to be asked in. He used to talk about you, the man continued, hands clasped behind his back like a soldier reporting for something that wasn't duty but still felt sacred. Not often, and never for long. But every now and then, he'd get this faraway look, eyes all soft, like he was listening to music no one else could hear, and he'd say, if my sister ever finds her way back, tell her I kept the promise. Ellie's brow furrowed, and the question rose before she could stop it, quiet, confused, but urgent, what promise? The man hesitated, reached into the pocket of his jacket, and pulled out a key, small, brass, and worn down on one side like it had been carried more for comfort than for use. He gave me this 2 days before his accident, the man said, placing the key in Ellie's outstretched hand. Said there was something in the old storage shed behind the warehouse. Said if you came back, it was yours. They drove in the man's truck, the kind that rattled like it still remembered every mile it had ever traveled, and the road to the warehouse was overgrown with weeds and thyme, nearly swallowed by years of disuse. But when they reached the rusted fence and passed through the gap someone had once cut for easier access, Ellie felt something stir in her chest, faint, but steady, like a lantern flickering back to life. The shed stood alone in the far corner of the lot, leaning slightly to one side, the door padlocked with a chain that had turned the color of dried blood. Her hands didn't shake as much this time, memory, it seemed, had begun to anchor her, and she fit the key into the lock with the kind of precision that comes only from something buried deep within muscle memory. Inside, it was dark, the air thick with the scent of oil, paper, and secrets. She stepped in slowly, letting her eyes adjust, and there, in the middle of the room, sat a wooden trunk, simple, rectangular, its top carved with her initials and a date she didn't recognize. She opened it without ceremony, because there are moments in life that don't need build-up, only courage, and inside were dozens of cassette tapes, each one labeled with careful handwriting, to Ellie. 1991, Christmas. To Ellie. 1992, Spring. And so on, year after year, until the very last, to Ellie. 2003, the last. Her heart lurched, not because of the finality of the label, but because she realized he'd been recording these messages for her, one every year, even after she left, even after the world had assumed she wasn't coming back. The man placed a tape recorder gently on the floor beside her, its buttons faded from use, and Ellie inserted the final tape, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed play. Ray's voice came through, soft and slower than she remembered, like he'd been tired when he recorded it, but still him, unmistakably him. Ellie, if you're hearing this, you found the key. Good. I always figured you would, eventually. I won't say much. Just this, I never stopped waiting. And I hope, wherever you are, you found your way home in time to remember who you've always been. The tape ended with a soft click that echoed louder than any goodbye ever had. Ellie leaned back against the wall of the shed, closed her eyes, and let the weight of all those years wash over her like rain on a tin roof, steady, cleansing, and impossible to ignore. She opened her eyes slowly, turned to the man who had waited quietly nearby, and asked, not because she expected an answer, but because the question itself needed air. Why didn't he ever tell me? Because I asked him not to, came a voice from the shadows just outside the shed, quiet and unmistakably female, with the kind of tone that carried years of waiting inside it, like an old coat sewn with secrets in every seam. Ellie turned her head slowly, her breath catching in her throat before she even saw the woman's face, because the voice already told her more than the words ever could. Out of the dusk stepped a woman, older now, maybe in her 80s, but with a posture that still held dignity like armor, and eyes that had clearly once burned with fire before life cooled them into quiet coals. Her hair was silver and pulled into a long braid that hung over one shoulder, and her hands, weathered and elegant, were folded in front of her like she was bracing for something she'd waited a lifetime to say. "You don't remember me, Ellie," she said, her voice calm but lined with sorrow, "but I knew you once, well enough to know when you left, you weren't just running from grief. You were running from something you didn't have the words for yet." Ellie stared at her, heart thudding softly beneath her ribs like a drum muffled by a quilt, and said nothing, because in that moment, she couldn't tell if she was listening to a stranger or a ghost. "My name's Lorraine," the woman continued, stepping closer now, her eyes never leaving Ellie's, "and once, a long time ago, I was your brother's best-kept secret." Maggie rose slowly, shifting closer to Ellie's side, ears alert, body calm, the way she always did when something important, something true, was about to happen. Ellie narrowed her eyes, not in suspicion but in that slow dawning of recognition that comes when the mind doesn't remember a person, but the soul does. And then it hit her, not a memory, but a whisper of one, laughter on a summer night, Ray sitting too close to someone on the back porch, someone who never came inside, someone he only spoke of in half-sentences and sideways glances. "You loved him," Ellie said, more statement than question, her voice cracking slightly as she spoke. Lorraine nodded slowly, her fingers brushing a tear from her cheek with the kind of practiced grace that only comes from years of crying where no one could see. "We loved each other," she said, "but it wasn't the kind of love folks here were ready to bless. Ray always said he didn't care, but I did. I had a family, a reputation, a daughter of my own. It wasn't easy back then, being two people at once, the woman the world saw and the one I was when he looked at me." Ellie stepped forward, the cassette tape still clutched in her hand, and stared at the woman who had just shifted the ground beneath her feet without even raising her voice. "You asked him to keep you a secret," she whispered, almost disbelieving. "All this time, he carried you like a shadow." Lorraine's eyes softened, and her voice grew gentler still. "And he never once blamed me," she said. "Even when you left and he needed someone to blame, he never laid it at my feet. But I think part of him hoped you'd remember us both, someday." The man who had brought Ellie to the shed stepped back, giving them space, his presence now more like background than participant, and Maggie settled again beside the door, eyes half closed but still alert, as though keeping watch over a reunion that was long overdue. "There's something else," Lorraine said, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out a photograph, faded and creased, edges curled like dried leaves. She handed it to Ellie without explanation. It showed Ray, younger and smiling, standing with Lorraine and a girl, a teenager then, maybe 15, whose eyes were unmistakably similar to Ellie's own. Ellie stared at it, stunned. "Who is this?" she asked, voice almost breaking. Lorraine exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "That's my daughter. Her name's June. But she isn't just mine." Ellie's heart thudded hard against her chest, and she suddenly felt the world tilt, like the floor beneath her had shifted while she wasn't looking. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Are you saying Ray had a child?" "Yes," Lorraine said, and that single word, so small, so simple, seemed to bend the air around them, pressing down like the heat of a southern storm just before the sky breaks open with rain that knows no mercy. "Ray was her father. He never told anyone but me. And I never told anyone but you." Ellie sat slowly on the step of the shed, the photograph trembling slightly in her hand as her thoughts whirled not like wind, but like slow-turning wheels from a train that's been off the tracks for far too long. She studied the picture again, as if the truth might change if she stared hard enough, but there it was, etched in the lines of the young girl's face, Ray's nose, her own eyes, something about the way the smile held more weight than joy. "He never said a word," Ellie murmured, her voice thick with confusion and the rising tide of something deeper, shame, maybe, or grief in a new costume. Lorraine sat beside her, her knees stiff, her posture careful, as if sharing the truth after so many decades had left her lighter in soul but heavier in body. "He wanted to," she said. "So many times. But he didn't want to hurt you. You just lost your mother, and then your brother, and he thought one more truth might break you." Ellie shook her head, not in disbelief, but in sorrow for all the time that had slipped away like sand through ungrateful fingers. He was wrong, she said quietly. That truth would have saved me. Would have given me a reason to come back sooner. Lorraine placed a hand on Ellie's shoulder, not to comfort, but to steady her, like a railing in a house you once knew how to walk through blind. June never knew either, she said. I told her he was just a friend. A kind man who visited sometimes. But after he passed, she found the letters. Ellie's eyes widened slowly, turning toward Lorraine with a mix of surprise and a quiet kind of terror, the kind you feel when you realize someone's been carrying your story all this time, and you didn't even know it was missing. What letters? She asked, though her heart already knew the answer. Dozens, Lorraine said, her voice catching slightly. He wrote to her every birthday. Every Christmas. Every time he missed one of her school plays or couldn't drive by the house. He never mailed them, but he wrote them anyway. Left them in a shoebox in the attic. Maggie stirred beside them, ears perked, as though sensing the moment's weight, not in volume, but in the way it lingered in the air like perfume from a room just left. She read them all, Lorraine continued. Every single one. And that's how she found out who he really was. Ellie closed her eyes, picturing a girl, now a grown woman, sitting alone in an attic, unfolding letters written by a man she thought was a friend, only to learn he was something more, something forever. Where is she now? Ellie asked, not because she was ready, but because the question could no longer be avoided. Lorraine smiled faintly and pulled another envelope from her coat, sealed in fresh white with a name written across the front in a strong, elegant hand, Eleanor May Green. She's been looking for you, Lorraine said, placing it in Ellie's hands. She wanted to give you this in person, but she didn't know how to find you. Until now. Ellie stared at the envelope as though it might vanish if she blinked, her breath shallow, her pulse thick in her ears. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the name, and inside was a single page, neat, deliberate handwriting, the kind that comes from someone who's waited too long to say what they mean. Dear Aunt Ellie. I've seen you in pictures, heard you in stories, and read you between every line my father wrote. If you're reading this, then we've found each other, and that's all I've ever hoped for. I'd like to meet you. I'd like to walk where he walked. And I'd like you to come with me, to the last place he went before he left this world behind. He called it the end of the road, but I believe it's where things begin. June. Ellie folded the letter slowly, eyes full but dry, her fingers clutching the paper like a lifeline that reached across decades. She looked at Lorraine, voice steady now, though quiet as a church after the last hymn fades. Where is the end of the road? It's not far, Lorraine said softly, standing up with the deliberate grace of someone who knew that what came next was sacred, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it had carried in silence for so long. Ray used to go there when he needed peace. It was the only place where he said the noise quieted enough to hear the truth. Ellie didn't ask any more questions, not then, because the name June, now wrapped in warmth instead of mystery, echoed through her like the sound of wind moving through the trees of her childhood, whispering reminders she thought were lost for good. Lorraine walked with her to the edge of the clearing, pointed toward a narrow trail cut through the woods, and gave her a look that needed no words. She went alone, with Maggie by her side, the trail winding like a memory too complicated to be straight, the canopy above them casting a patchwork of light and shadow across the moss-covered ground. The path wasn't difficult, but it required attention, roots curled like fingers reaching for forgotten feet, and old stones rose from the earth like secrets trying to speak again. As they climbed the last gentle slope, the trees parted like curtains in an old theater, and Ellie stepped into a clearing so quiet, it felt like time itself had paused to let her breathe. A single bench sat in the center, hand-carved, the initials RG etched into the armrest, the wood worn smooth from years of visits, years of waiting. Across the clearing, facing the bench, stood a woman, mid-30s, tall, with Ray's walk and Ellie's eyes, and a presence that made the space feel suddenly whole. She didn't smile right away. She didn't rush forward or speak in rehearsed phrases. She just stood there and let Ellie take her in the way a person absorbs a long-lost melody, note by note, heartbeat by heartbeat. You came, the woman finally said, and the words dropped into the space between them like a stone into water, quiet, sure, undeniable. Ellie nodded, her voice thick but calm. I didn't know I was supposed to, she said. Until I got there, and everything started coming back. June walked forward, each step slow, deliberate, as though she understood that this meeting wasn't about what they would say, but about what they would feel through every silence between the words. She reached into her coat and pulled out a journal, leather-bound, worn, Ray's handwriting covering the first page. He wrote this for you, she said, placing it in Ellie's hands. Every year after you left, he added to it, letters, thoughts, poems, even drawings sometimes. He said he didn't care if you ever read them, as long as they existed. Because he believed memory wasn't just what we kept in our minds, it was what we gave to others, when they needed to find themselves again. Ellie sat on the bench, opened the journal to the first page, and read a single line written in Ray's familiar scrawl. If she forgets who she is, remind her, she is love, and she is known, and she was never gone from me. The weight of it was almost too much to hold, not because of the sorrow, but because of the mercy of it, that someone could love her enough to build a map back to herself when she was too lost to even know she was missing. June sat beside her, silent, steady, as Maggie curled up at their feet, eyes closed, breathing even. For a long moment, they didn't speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because some truths are so full they need space just to settle. Then Ellie turned, slowly, voice cracking open for the final time like a door that had been sealed by time and sorrow, and whispered the one question she'd carried through every step of the journey, though she'd never dared speak it aloud. Why me? Why would he leave all this, for me? And June, without hesitation, answered in a voice calm as dusk and strong as morning. Because you were the only one who ever reminded him who he was. And in that moment, everything returned, not just memory, but meaning. The places. The faces. The years. They came not all at once, but like rain soaking into dry soil, quietly, deeply, until Ellie remembered not just who she had been, but why it had mattered that she come back at all. She looked out at the clearing, the bench, the trees, the woman beside her, and finally, after all those years, she smiled. Because the road hadn't ended here. It had just begun. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.